Conducting a threat assessment or an area study. Usually something for a tactical commander, but I'm going to try and break this down for you guys today, for the civilian, to do an area study, a threat assessment in your AO, your area of operation, where you live, where you operate, where you work. With that, welcome to the podcast where we talk about this topic and, God willing, many more, the right way with God Almighty at the center, biblical, Judeo-Christian values, and real-world first-hand experience. On that, first and foremost, I am a Christian. That is first and foremost in everything that I do and the way that I look at the world. This podcast is no different. God has blessed me to be military, law enforcement, private security contracting. I've been the commander of a tactical team to stop active shooters. I've been in charge of, large amounts of people in training. I was an urban warfare instructor for the Marine Corps. I've been put in charge of security and, let's just say for really expensive equipment and a lot of people. Planning things like operation orders. And that's all going to play in today on this episode. Now I'm going to try and break this down Barney style. Super simple. Some of you guys may be too young to know what that was. But I'm going to try and break this down. If there's an acronym like BAMSIS or METTC, I'm going to try and leave the acronyms out of it. A lot of guys try and be super tactical and throw out all the acronyms. Acronyms are kind of important when you're in the military, when you're in law enforcement. And if you want to look up the acronyms and what those mean, you can. But I'm going to just try and break it down and adapt them to you for what's useful for you, the average, John Q. public, the average citizen that wants to be prepared. If you're a sergeant in the Marine Corps, infantry, leading men in combat, you know all this stuff. You know these. You learned it, and you relearned it. And if you went to combat in the global war on terror, right, you learned it in the school of hard knocks, right? You learned it in the real world where the consequences were death. So I don't need to rehash that for you. This is not for you. But maybe this will help you adapt it to the civilian life. But this is geared more towards the average person that cares about being prepared. I'm going to look at a couple of different areas here. Let's start out with a broad category, climate. Where do you live? Right? If you live in the Pacific Northwest, if you live in Seattle, versus if you live in the Southwest or you live in Southern California, right? They both have threats. They're both going to have climatic impacts, but some are going to be way more influential to your area, right? If you live in Southern California and there's a major disaster, water is going to be a problem. Getting clean water is going to be a problem. If you live in the Seattle area, as long as you can get out of Seattle proper, finding clean water is probably much less of a problem. Having too much water there might be the problem. You get the idea. What is the climate in your area? What are the climatic challenges in your area? Right, if you live in Florida, most places in Florida, it's hurricanes. If you live in upstate New York, it's ice storms, nor'easters, things like that. I'm not going to go through all the examples, but you get the idea. Look at, the 100-year floodplain for your area. Look at the worst storms, since we've settled the Americas, since Christendom, since, we liberated the, pagan Indians from their heathen ways. Look at that history and what are the worst disasters in this area? What should I be prepared for as far as climate goes? And it doesn't have to be anything major. Like if you live in places where it routinely gets above 110 degrees, and I've lived in, the Sonoran Desert, I've lived in the Mojave, spent a lot of time in the Mojave. Right? What are your things you need to be more prepared for in those areas? But look at climate, the, nature factor, environment, also terrain. This, do you live in a fairly flat area, right? Do you live in Kansas or Nebraska? Most of Nebraska. I know there are some hills in Nebraska, some like the Black Hills, but do you live in a very flat area, windy Great Plains? Or do you live in very hilly mountainous terrain? I live in the Rocky Mountains. That's a huge terrain feature. If I have to cross a mountain range, some parts of the year that's just not going to happen. At least off of a road, that's just probably not feasible. That's a natural barrier, those Rockies in the wintertime. I have to know that, right? What is your terrain in your area? It could be swamp. There are things you can do to mitigate that, right? You could have cross-country skis for the wintertime. You could have, certain things for the swamp. But what's the terrain like? This is an important thing you should consider. How about major supply routes for your area? Both for the good and the bad, right? If you are in, let's say, Denver is a major, right, international airport. That could be good. If you travel a lot for work, you might live in Denver for that reason. You can get to a major airport and fly around the world pretty quick. If we have an actual pandemic, not like a fake pandemic, but like an actual pandemic that kills big chunks of the population, right, Denver's going to be a bad place to be because people from all over the world fly in there all the time. Right, do you live in Louisiana, a major port city? Do you live in, one of the big oil hubs in Texas? Could be good for the economy, could be good for jobs, for work, but that could be really bad if we come under some kind of terrorist attack because that's a major target. But, major supply routes in your area, railroad depots, obviously port cities, major highways that go in and out of anywhere close to where you are. There's advantages and disadvantages to that, but you should at least know what and where those are. Could be advantageous, right? If all the highways are shut down, there's roadblocks or they're impassable. If you live near a railroad depot, whatever, you could probably find several different tracks that lead out of town if you need to get out of town and not be on a road. Just an example of how that can work both ways. Government. How oppressive is your government? You might be thinking, oh, America, freedom. Well, if you're like me, big Second Amendment guy, gun guy, right? Some of the states in the U.S. are worse than some of the other places around the world for gun ownership. Like a lot of modern guns are felonies in California. Have fun trying to carry, a handgun in New York. I know it's technically possible, but super prohibitive, right? So government, how oppressive is the government in your area? Like, look at what they did, pretty good indicator, what they do during COVID. Did they arrest preachers for preaching the gospel during COVID? It's a pretty oppressive government, right? It's something to be aware of. That wasn't even like a real disaster. Right, if we look at, the areas during Hurricane Katrina where they were going door to door and doing gun confiscations. That's a thing to be aware of. Also on the better part, right, there's, counties, states, places in Montana, Idaho, even Oregon, some places that are sanctuary counties in different ways. Some are like, I'm not going to enforce, some of the sheriffs are like, I'm not going to enforce any firearms law. Like, I'm not going to enforce, even if the state passes some draconian, infringement on the Second Amendment, they're not going to enforce it. That's good to know. There are also some places that are sanctuary cities. As far as like immigration goes, we'll get into demographics in a bit, but again, government, oppression, or freedom, that's a good thing to know and a pretty good indicator of if you live in the right place or not. And I guess that's a pretty good place to move into demographics. Human threats, people behaving badly in good times or bad times. If things, if the peanut butter and chocolate doesn't hit the fan in our lifetime, what is the violent crime in your area right now? Right, my wife and I went to live in Alaska. I really thought I would like Alaska. I wanted to like Alaska. But, Alaska has got some of the highest violent crime. I think it's the highest violent crime state in the country. Right, women get, let's just say, abused there all the time. Not really a place I want my wife to be, right? Not that I couldn't protect her from it, but I can't when I'm not around. Not that she can't protect herself and not that she doesn't carry a gun, but just why? That's something to be aware of. What are the violent crime statistics in your area right now? Like, not even if, again, the peanut butter and chocolate doesn't hit the fan. What are the violent crime statistics in your area right now? What are the violent gangs operating in your area right now, right? As you're going back to, like, the supply routes, do the Hells Angels operate a major meth route going through wherever you live? And you might be surprised, right? You might be in the middle of, like, the Dakotas, and you just happen to be on a highway where, they traffic that stuff all the time. Right? Are you in somewhere like Southern California or Vegas where they do human trafficking a lot? Like, they do that everywhere, but, like, a lot. That's something to be aware of. What are the major street gangs, right? MS-13, the Crips, the Bloods, skinheads, white supremacists, right? Whatever is in your area. A threat assessment in your area. And I'm sure if you live anywhere in any city, let's say over 100,000 people, which I would consider a pretty big city, there's gangs in your area. Rest assured, they're around. So what are they? What are the indicators? What do they look like? What's their area of operation? What's their modus operandi? Just meaning, what do they do? Like, what's their main way they make money? Different gangs specialize in different things. Again, Hells Angels, big into meth. MS-13, heavy into all kinds of narcotics. Asian gangs may lead more towards human trafficking. So do that assessment for yourself. Don't just turn a blind eye and be like, oh, well, I don't think there's any in my cul-de-sac, so I don't have to worry about whatever gang. If they're in your area, you should probably be aware of them and probably know what they look like, what they wear. They'll generally have different gang signs. Getting to what I think is a bigger threat, what about Islam? Islam, and I'm not going to apologize for saying this, Islam is a nasty religion. It's a false religion. Their head dude, Muhammad, he's a child molester, was a child molester. He's dead, and he stayed dead, unlike Christ, right? He's a child molester. He married a 6-year-old girl. He's a child molester. That's a horrible religion. That's what they do. They still molest girls. Look at what's going on in the UK right now with all those trials. Islam, Muslim, they have been killing Christian men for 1,200 years and taking their women and doing horrible, unspeakable things to them for 1,200 years. You think because we invite them over here, they're going to start drinking Coca-Cola and wearing T-shirts and singing Kumbaya? No, they're going to kill you, cut your head off, and take your women. That's what they do. And when they get to a capacity where they think they can pull that off, they'll do it here. So what's the community of Islam in your area? Not even radical Islam. They're just regular Islam. It is radical. The ones that don't practice, they're like, Islam in name only. But if you read the Quran, if you read the surahs, if you read, The Sword and the Scimitar, good book about the 1,200-year struggle between Christendom and Islam, you'll understand. I don't care about political correctness, I care about truth. So what's that like in your area, right? Do you live in Dearborn, Michigan? Like, you got problems. You got a lot of problems, including the water. But one of the big ones is Islam, right? Do you live, going back to, do you live in Kansas? Probably way less of a problem. But what are the major threats in your area? If you do have a heavy Islamic presence, are they Sunni or are they Shia? Right, you should probably know the difference and know what they believe, what they think. Know your enemy, right? Sun Tzu, Art of War. It's part of what you're doing in this threat assessment, knowing your enemy. Right, how many Somali daycares do you have in your area? Might be a pretty good indicator. Now, let me be clear. Nothing would make me happier than for all the Muslims in the world to come to Christ. And then they would be my brothers. They would be my brothers as much as my flesh and blood brother. I would love for that to happen, but I'm also prepared if they pick up a knife and try and cut somebody's head off, which they do regularly. What about other cultural threats, right? Talking about area study and where you live. How big is the whole woke movement and them trying to mutilate your kids' genitals? I'm not going to pull punches today, but what is that like in your area? Oh, and on that note, guys, I'm really bad at marketing myself here, but right? As you might imagine from things I've said today, I'm not getting a lot of corporate sponsors, and I refuse sponsors anyway. I've gotten offered sponsorships, and I refuse them because I don't want to take bribes, and I don't want to pull punches as to what I say is being true or not. That said, I'm doing a 40-day break on the ads. Normally the ads are put in not by me. I don't know the ads. The host puts in the ads to help pay because it costs me money to put out the podcast, and they cover that with the ads. I took those out, paying out of my own pocket to get the podcast out there. If you want to support the podcast, if you like the content that's being put out, if you think it's worth something, if you think it's worth $5 a month, consider becoming a patron. There should be a Patreon link in the show notes. So please consider doing that. Okay, where was I? Oh yeah, mutilating your kids' genitals. If you have kids, that's more of an issue than if you don't have kids. If you're a solid, biblically grounded man, you're probably not going to one day wake up and decide you're a woman. But kids are impressionable, and peer pressure is a real thing. So, right, if you do live in that area, public school, maybe not, right? So, I'm not a big fan of public school anyway. I did very well in public school. I was, distinguished honor roll student. And I thought that school was largely a giant waste of time, and I think it probably took the majority of my 20s to unlearn all the garbage they taught me in public school that was just false, and a false worldview and horrible, promoting of sin and horrible lifestyles. And I didn't grow up a Christian, so I didn't have that Christian base, and it took me a long time to get unmessed up from public school. But hey, some public schools are probably better than others. So if you have kids or looking to have kids, that's probably something you should put in your area study. We talked a little bit about targets, like infrastructure targets, but any specific things that are more likely to be targeted in your areas. Nuclear facilities, that'd be a big one. Military bases, that'd be a big one, right? Those are going to be targets. They could also be assets, right? They could, be a bulwark in your community if we are getting attacked or something. But they also could initially be a very big target. So, what military bases are in your area? Are they Air Force bases or are they Army bases? Right? National Guard Armory is going to be much less of a target than somewhere like Norfolk, Virginia, right? So do your own area study on that. Figure out what targets could be, and it could be other than those. Those are just examples. How about civil conflict right now or in the recent past, right? When there was all the Antifa, when there was, I guess there's still Antifa, but like our last charade of fake outrage and Antifa violence. So consider that conflict, right? If you live in a high gang area, Crips versus Bloods, right? That's a real thing in some places in Southern California. Obviously, if you live anywhere along the southwestern border, right? Texas, Arizona, right? Those are hotbeds for civil conflict. That should go in your threat assessment. Now, the whole idea of you doing this threat assessment is what can you do about it, right? Just once you gather the intel, the intelligence, the information, I'm trying to not use military terms as much as I can, or just for the sake of using acronyms. Once you have that, what's your plan of action? What's your things you're going to put into place? What are your steps you're going to take? A big one I would say is move. If you're like, wow, I really live in a crap area. Yeah, move, right? We're not in the Iron Curtain yet, right? As much as I joke about the Mississippi River, east of the Mississippi River being like Mordor, or, California, Oregon, Washington being like the Iron Curtain. As much as I joke about that, you can freely move around right now. You can move state to state, right? Our ancestors did it in covered wagons facing dysentery and smallpox. Right, all you have to do is get on Indeed and find a job. You can probably do that, right? Be a man, if you think that's what's best for you and your family. But you might decide, I need to move right now. Or if you're not going to move, what are your plans of action? Maybe you want to find a location that you maybe buy a backup piece of property for, or a place or a relative that lives outside of that area that you can go visit more often and be nice to and build relationships with. right? Whatever the case is, start forming your plan of action. Going back to the ingress-egress routes, what's that going to be for you, right? If there's a major freeway going in and out of your place or where you live, that's probably a bad way to try and get out if there's a major disaster. That's where everybody's going to go. Again, secondary routes, railroads, rivers. What are ways you can get out if the primary way is not there? So looking at that. Something like a meetup point, somewhere where you can go to rally, maybe a fallback point, a designated one where if comms go down, and communication will generally go down in a big disaster, like phones probably aren't going to work just because everybody's trying to use them at the same time. So where are you going to meet up? Where are you going to meet with those people that you're, planning on weathering out a storm with, either an actual storm or a metaphorical storm like Antifa riots? Where are those people? Where are you going to meet them? I do the whole other podcast, Gunfighter Life, where I talk about guns and gun stuff and defense a lot. So I'm just not really going to get into that here. Well, that's something you should think about, getting back to the threat portion, the enemy portion, whoever the enemy is, likely in your area. Right? What are their tactics? You might want to think about that in terms of defense. And as much as I like guns and use guns for a lot of things, guns don't solve every problem. You're not going to shoot your way out of a hurricane. Right? The coolest guns in the world are not going to get you out of a wildfire. So you got to have other plans as well. Don't make it all about the tactical. This is a broad, big topic. I'm just trying to kind of hit the high points to get you thinking about making your own threat assessment, making your own area study for where you live and what's important and germane to you. Obviously, I don't know you. I don't know where you live, unless you're somebody I actually know, obviously. But I don't know you. I don't know where you live. Do you live in Dearborn, Michigan? Do you live in San Diego? Those are two very different places with very different threats. One of the major factors, and I don't care really where you live, high population density. High population density. And what I mean by that is higher than the carrying capacity of the land. Just kind of by the way that by definition, cities are consumers of things, right? Not producers of things. Especially as far as like food and water and raw materials go. Those generally get brought in from other places. What happens when those aren't being brought in? Right? Population density is an important part of the equation. How is that being propped up now as far as like chemical fertilizers and industrial farming and, clean water getting trucked in or aqueducts or, things like that? And then what happens when that goes away? How many people are there versus how many people that land can actually sustain? And what are those people going to do when it doesn't arrive? And how long do you have? Population density is a huge one. Don't overlook the population density. Okay, with that, I think there's enough here for you to get started. Start chewing on that. Start maybe taking some notes, doing some of your own research for your own area. Normally I do a tactical tip of the day and then a tactical verse of the day. I'm going to kind of overarchingly blend those in today. There are times when you have to go it alone. It's better to go it alone than to sin and do the wrong thing and forsake God and not trust in God. David, a man after God's own heart. If you remember, he was supposed to be king, but King Saul wanted to kill him, the current king. Tried to pin him to the wall with a spear. He fled. He fled on his own. Even his best friend Jonathan stayed behind. He was on his own for a while. But then, once he got away, he started building community. He started building a core group of men around him to become part of a community. So, what I'm going to tell you here is if you have to go it alone, it's better to go it alone and do the right thing even if you're forsaken and persecuted for it. But if you can, build a community. Look at David for that example. You might want to read his story. And part of the tips part of building a community, I'm not going to push any particular denomination down your throat here, but go to a like-minded church. Right, that's a good place to find community. Go to Go to gun shows if you're into guns, right? Go to, if you're more of the homesteady type, go to, homesteady type stuff. If you're into bushcraft, go to a bushcraft conventions in your area, right? Try and make a community. Those are some biblical thoughts and tips for the day. With that, guys, thanks for listening, and have a blessed day.